On today's program, I interview Stephen Sora. Stephen Sora has been researching historical enigmas since 1982 and is the author of The Triumph of the Sea Gods, The Lost Colony of the Templars, Secret Societies of America's Elite, and the cult classic, The Lost Treasure of the Knights Templar. And that's the book we'll be discussing today. In this book, Stephen Sora offers a compelling argument that the lost treasure of the Knights Templar is connected to the mysterious money pit on Oak Island, Nova Scotia, that has baffled treasure hunters for over 2 centuries. Click like on the video, make your comment below, and above all, enjoy the program. Stephen Sora, welcome to the program.
Great to be here, Russell.
Much of the Oak Island mystery is anecdotal. When researching in general, really, how do you separate fact from fiction?
I think there is a lot of fiction that gets put into it, but the history of it is, pretty solid from 1795 up until recently. Some of the stories, like the Curse of Oak Island, I don't know who started that. One person died a long time ago, then another person, and then 4 died. And I'm not sure when they put up the plaque, but I think it just it sells the show, I guess. So something like that would be fiction. I was just going over with someone in Italy the 2 different stories about when the 3 young men discovered it, and there is 2 versions, although I would go with the most popular version, that it was 3 boys rowing out to look for buried treasure.
As opposed to 3 men?
Now, as opposed to someone that was already living on the island that discovered the tree that had been cut away in the tackle block. So I believe that people saw strange lights there. This is in, several books that I read. And so these 3 kids, or young men, they rowed out and they found a spot that looked like someone had dug there before.
So, for the audience who doesn't know, could you give us sort of a synopsis of what the Oak Island mystery is? I could tell it, but I'm not the historian.
Okay, the story begins in 1795, and like I said, 3 young men rowed out to one of the numerous islands that's in Mahone Bay, and they're looking around because they always heard stories about Captain Kidd and other pirates that were there. So they see this area where the ground is a little bit recessed, and there's something hanging in a tree over it, and the tree branches were sawed off there, so it looked like something had happened there. So they start digging, and this is kind of amazing. At 3 feet, they found flagstones, which are not indigenous to the island, so they got them all out. Then at 10 feet, they discovered an oak platform, and they took out the platform. The dirt underneath had recessed, so they dug that another 10 feet down, another platform. Then a 3rd platform was at 30 feet, and at that point, they were not able to do this on their own anymore. They asked for people in town to help, but no one was really interested. These were people that, was kind of subsistence farming and fishing, and they didn't have time for that kind of nonsense. So 6 years later, a doctor is called out because I think it was the McGinnis baby was being born, and they told the doctor the whole story about their dig, and he decided he wanted to get involved. So when he went back to his hometown, which was Onslow, he got a bunch of businessmen together, and they put a lot of money in, and they began work in 1803. And it was Anthony Vaughan, I think, that had the baby. He was the only one that was involved. And in 1845, he was still there at age 63, I think it was. And they did another syndicate. And every time they did these, they ran into problems. The biggest problem was in 1850, they discovered that there were flood tunnels. And how this came about was they got to 90 feet, a platform at every 10 feet level, and then a stone that said something about a certain amount of feet further, $2 million in bullion. So one day they get down to 90 feet, they take up the platform, people went to church that day. When they came back, they noticed the whole thing was flooded. The whoever built the money pit had a hydraulic knowledge and ability to construct something that there were actually drains that came from both sides of the island, and when you hit a certain level, these drains would open and water would flood the tunnel. Water would flood the shaft, so they couldn't go any further. And how they discovered this was they threw red dye and dynamite into the pit, and the red dye came out on both sides of the island, so they knew they had a bigger problem. From there, from 1850, they just kept buying bigger and bigger pipes, bigger and bigger pumps, so they could get further down, maybe get the water out. It just never worked. And they just kept on drilling new shafts, new cross tunnels. They built a dam to hold the water from coming into it, which lasted a couple days until it rained, and they never got any further than that. In 1901, probably about the 10th syndicate, Franklin Delano Roosevelt joined it, and he actually went there and did work, invested money, and was part of the whole thing for a while. It just kept going like that. 1965 was a guy named Dunfield built the causeway. The island is like maybe a half a mile off the shore, and it was difficult to get to with boats. He decided he wanted to bring big construction vehicles, and he did, and he made it quite a mess of the island, and then he left. He found nothing. Then a guy named David Tobias took over in 1966. He had been stationed in the area during World War II, and he heard the story about the work and all, and he bought basically most of the island, formed a company called Triton Alliance, and they dug the famous shaft called Borehole 10X, which is what everybody seems to think is, the place to work right now. And as he brought in a partner, they soon became not too friendly with each other. They wouldn't talk to each other for the longest time, and his family also kind of wanted him to get off because he was spending millions there, and I guess he was spending the family fortune. So he left, and he sold to a couple of brothers called the Lagina Brothers from Michigan, and their company and a handful of other people. And in 1996, they lost the permit to dig any further, so it took just about 10 years to get started again. And what they're doing now is they're still digging Borehole 10X, which is the one that killed everybody so far. The original money pit, they're digging there. There's a giant swamp, and no mention of Donald Trump, but they're draining the swamp because they think there's something under there. They actually found ship planks that wouldn't have been there unless a ship was sunk in the swamp. And they're moving along with a whole bunch of different theories. So far, they haven't really found anything but wood, and most of the wood that they found dates to other one of the expeditions to dig up the money pit. So it's still kind of in limbo.
Even if it's a hoax, it's an incredibly elaborate hoax. Even that alone would be amazing.
It would be, because the estimates are that it would take at least a year to build what they built there.
And why build it for nothing?
Right.
Yeah. Well, to quote from your book, who dug the money pit and what lies below? In your book, you were able to dismiss certain candidates such as the Vikings.
The Vikings, it would have probably been impossible. They were never known to have that, hydraulic education to kind of build out something like, what was built there. They were like short-termers. The longest colony was in Newfoundland, and I visited it, and in 3 months they put up a whole bunch of houses. They had sheep with them. They built a boat building plant, and they stayed 3 years, and either because of the weather or they were just done with it, they went back to Norway, and that was it. So, they wouldn't have had, gold and silver and all that they needed something complicated to build. Another story is that a Spanish ship might have came, and just say it got hit by a hurricane. It was limping. It landed in Mahone Bay. They decided that they'd never make it with the load that they have on the ship, so built this elaborate thing and took off again, and then got hit with another storm and didn't make it. So nobody really knows who built it then at that point. I kind of discount that because there's like hundreds of islands in Mahone Bay. I think it's 350. And if no one discovered that part of the world before, there would have been plenty of places to hide it without going through all that work.
You also mentioned Sir Francis Drake.
When I first talked to David Tobias, that was his theory. And I spent almost a year reading on Sir Francis Drake, and he actually had a secret mission where he might have came up the Pacific past California. Like he said to have, I think, made it to San Diego and then San Francisco, but he actually might have went up to Alaska. And but when he came back, the Queen got half the money, he got the rest. He had enough money to construct this giant home. He built, interestingly enough, a water system for his town, and he just spent, money without worrying who, thought what of it. So it wasn't him. And then my version was, and Mr. Tobias kind of agreed with it, that it would have been somebody like the Knights Templar. And specifically, there was this family called the Sinclair family. They were one of the wealthiest families in Scotland. They were part of the Crusades. During the Crusades, they were part of the Templars, and they stole treasures out of the Temple of Jerusalem. They were also like a bank where you could put your gold in the London Temple and take it out in Jerusalem. This way you wouldn't have to carry, say, half of your net worth across the world where it could be robbed, could be sunk on a ship or whatever. So it was kind of the first branch banking. And they ran all of this. So after the Crusades were over, the Templars were kind of ostracized, and the French king had the Templars arrested. He had the Paris Temple, which was the main headquarters at that point. He wanted to basically rob their bank. So, but they had been tipped off. Not only were they the biggest fleet in the world, the biggest bank in the world, one of the biggest property holders, they probably had the best intelligence of anyone at that time. And so the treasure had been loaded onto wagon trains, carried to the port of La Rochelle, and then brought up to Scotland. And somebody asked me, is that just a story? But it's not. In the Templar trials in England, two Templars that were not tortured both came up with the same story to say, that where they hid the treasures. Later on, in 1398, Henry Sinclair sailed across the ocean. And without getting into the whole thing, there's a lot of evidence that he actually did, that he came over with ships, that he said he was going to start a colony there, and then he went home. Later on, it became a little bit rough for Scotland. They were under attack by the English, and also religiously, the tide was changing against Catholicism. So they feared that this treasure would be taken. They knew of where they had sailed into Nova Scotia, so I believe they brought the treasure over. The sister order with the Templars was something called Cistercians, and they were adept at building tunnels and bridges and everything, and some of their bridges still exist. The Saint Bernard was the one that kind of revitalized the order and also sponsored the Templar order, and so it would be they were connected. They built these they look like round churches, and that's what they're called, in a lot of different places. One of them in Newport, Rhode Island, one of them in Scotland, a whole bunch of them on these islands in the Baltic Sea, and they're all exactly the same. So I think that's evidence, too, that they had crossed the ocean and came to the New World. They also would have had the ability to build the tunnels and the drains and everything. But
it's still relatively crude, having said that they only had so much equipment having just crossed the ocean.
I've never seen the inside of the tunnels before, except for the borehole 10X, which basically person named Blankenship built that out. The stone buildings that they built, I did travel around to see them, and while they're crude because they're stones, at the same time they measured things like when the moon's cycle and the sun's cycle meet every 19 years, and so they're definitely, those things were built by someone with scientific ability.
Have you heard the rumor that the Scots perhaps came out of Egypt?
Yes. I'm not sure I buy into it, but there is a lot of interesting information that of people, crossing from one place to another, and the Stone of Scone and all being an Egyptian thing.
That somewhat connects to Solomon. Is it perhaps the wealth of Solomon that's buried on the island?
Yeah, the Templars originally were 9 men, and their purpose was to guard the highways against people getting robbed who were on pilgrimage to Jerusalem. And it seems like an impossible task, and it probably was just made up. They lived in the stables of the Temple of Solomon, and the only thing they really did in 9 years was excavate. So it's very possible that they had Solomon's treasures. Some people say, like the Ark of the Covenant, and they brought them to Paris and Scotland.
So are you suggesting that it could be the Ark of the Covenant?
It's been suggested, yep.
It would even fit inside? Like, would it have to be smaller than the shaft?
I guess it would have to. I'm not sure how big the Ark of the Covenant would be. I guess they had, they probably could have brought it into the shaft.
Listen, I'm sure you've more than considered the possibility that the Oak Island mystery is a hoax. You wrote this book, 20 years ago?
1999 was when I finished it, yep.
Has your view changed in the past 20 years? Do you believe it more now? Is it more mysterious?
The difference now, then I believed 100% that there's probably a treasure on the bottom of the money pit somewhere. Now I look at it as could be something different, that they actually moved it. And certainly the Sinclair family was, active in the United States up until the Revolution. There's some really weird stories that, well, they're not stories. The one Sinclair was Elizabeth, and she received all her father Henry's papers. Elizabeth married a guy named John Drummond. John Drummond moved to Madeira, where he was called John the Scot, and his family married into another family that Columbus married into. And Columbus and him were there at the same time, and it's possible that Columbus found out about some of this stuff from the Sinclairs. Columbus married Felipa Perestrella, who was the daughter of a captain in the Portuguese Navy, but he was originally from Genoa, where Columbus was from. And so the two families are connected. They lived there at the same time. Columbus's mother-in-law gave him all the logs of the sea captain that he had married her daughter, and so they were really active. And it's just, you wonder if what that connection meant. Columbus wasn't a Knights Templar, but the Knights Templar, when they were banned in Portugal, they turned into the Knights of Christ, and so Columbus had married into that order. And if you notice the flags, the crosses on the sails of Columbus, they're just like a Templar cross. So there's a connection there that I never went any further with, but certainly they had the ability to take out the treasure. And my own viewpoint is, like other pirate banks, you don't put it 300 feet into the earth. You dig a shaft, and then you have an entranceway on the side that goes up, and so that's where the bank is. So anyone that gets to the flood thing, is suckered into just keep on doing what they're doing now, where the treasure might be 20 feet under the earth somewhere else.
Just a red herring.
Yep, and it's also possible that the Templar Order came to the United States in the form of Freemasons, and they used the treasure. One of the most remarkable things is they also found about 12 miles away is a town called New Ross, and in New Ross, this house has the foundation going all around it. It looks like almost a miniature castle, but this may have been where they stashed some of the workers when they weren't being needed. Like, say, if engineers were coming in and the miners would live in this building. It's still there, and right across the street from it is a Masonic temple. So it's really interesting. I don't know, where that's going to go, but it's very possible that the whole Masonic order, is aware of the treasure there.
Or that it's maybe, perhaps, like I said, the red herring.
Again, yes, could be.
Like, why could they dig then what we can't dig now?
They can't stop the water, right?
But how could they dig it in the first place? Like, how could they have engineered this?
I asked someone that question that was involved with investing when it was Tobias's project, and he said the whole thing, you can read about it in a book called De Re Metallica that was basically a guide to mining in Italy during Roman times.
Assuming the engineering works, like they could figure out the engineering, would they have had the means to accomplish it? I guess that was the question. And you're saying this guy has said yes.
The Templar Navy, which later became Sinclair's Navy, was the biggest in the world. And so if anybody could sail around, to Nova Scotia or anyone else, any place else, they could do it themselves. What's interesting at those the drains, they're covered in eelgrass and coconut husks. So I don't know where the eelgrass might come from, but the coconut husks don't come from anywhere within 1,000 miles of Nova Scotia. So they were able to get those things for the project, and it's those two items that actually keep the drains from getting clogged up. If they could ever clog the drains, it might stop the water from coming in.
Let's say it turns out it's not the Freemasons. Excuse me, let's say it turns out not to be the Knights Templar. Who would your backup plan be?
Those are two entities, but they're connected. When the Knights Templar were banned, they reorganized as the Freemasons, and the Sinclairs became the hereditary guardians of the Freemasons. So it's just, it's like the Knights Templar and the Knights of Christ. They're pretty much one entity, slightly different. One I came across recently is there were certain people that had been doing things in the Caribbean in kind of the golden age of piracy, and one of them was a guy named Anson who had proposed. He was an admiral in England. He had proposed attacking Havana, and the theory is they attacked Havana. This is in 1762, and they brought everything from Havana, which was gigantic. It was the richest city in the Caribbean. They brought everything to Oak Island, and then they where they buried it, and then they brought certain items back, but definitely the smaller amount. The only reason I don't like this is at the time, 1762, there were already people on the island, not on Oak Island, but in the area like Chester and the Lunenburg. And so I think in fact, there were 300 families in 1763. So it would not have been gone unnoticed if that, had happened. And also, if it had happened, then the treasure would probably have been taken later.
We're almost out of time, just a few more minutes. In your book, you talk about the French connection. Can you talk about that?
There was a place called Rennes-le-Château in southern France, and in the last years of the 19th century, there was Father Saunier, who it was almost an insult for him to be stationed there because he came from a wealthy family, and here they got him in a little mountain town. And so he decided that he would excavate and refurbish the tiny little church they had. He seems to have found a couple things that are very important. One of them may be the genealogy of Christ after he supposedly died on the cross. And so this would have been an affront to the Catholic Church. And it's possibly he was blackmailing the church. And a lot of famous people would come and visit him. He got more and more wealthier. He rebuilt the whole town at some point, and including a very strange church. And so he's connected with some of the families that were in the Templars, and they think that maybe part of the treasure is something from the south of France.
Are you following the reality series?
Curse of Oak Island? Religiously, yep.
Have they ever contacted you, or?
No, and I tried emailing one of the people because they showed my book on the thing, and they showed a bookcase with like 5 books, and one of them was mine. So, but they never got back to me.
Really? Aren't they supposed to pay you for that?
No.
Oh. That's the first thing I think of. So what's the best information that's come out in the past 20 years? And has anything from this show materialized?
They found a couple items that they get all excited about, but they were really nothing important.
Now, do you think it's possible they're planted, though, for the sake of reality TV?
It could be, but it's so little what they're finding. And there's one interesting thing. There's a guy named Samuel Bell who was a black slave, and he fought for the British. The British told him, if you fight for us against the Americans, we'll give you a certain amount of land, kind of like 40 acres and a mule. And so he ended up getting one lot on Oak Island, and he kept paying with weird coins in town. And so people believe that, and then buying a whole lot of other property, people believe he may have been uncovering something, and probably closer to the surface of anywhere. So that was interesting, and I hadn't heard of that before, to the extent that, how much money he actually had. So that came out of the show. They found a Spanish piece of 8. The thing is that in 1600 to 1700 and then beyond, pieces of 8 circulated everywhere in the New World. If you were in New York City, the currency at the time was a piece of 8. So that's really, a non-starter as far as being anything. They found a parchment with VI on it, which, how can you even take a stab at what that could be? They found a piece of gold chain, which is interesting. With cameras, they found a body that's all the way at the bottom of 10X, but it might have been the first person that lost their life there. So, there's nothing strange there. I'm disappointed because I think if someone took the time to pick one place on Oak Island and really work it, they'd be doing better than, all the jumping around that they're doing.
Oh, so in some ways, do you feel that the show's failing?
I feel like the expedition's failing. The show's doing good for, a reality TV show. So I don't think they're doing bad. They have a production company that put up a lot of the money for them to get all these trucks and pay divers and things like that. But they may have burned through like $2 million a season. And, that's why it's called the money pit. People keep dropping money in it and nothing comes out.
And the last thing they want to do is find the treasure. That's the end of the show.
They could be entitled to some, so maybe not.
Hey, that's a good question. Who is entitled to the treasure, whoever finds it? Do you know the process there?
I think part of it is at the discretion of Nova Scotia, that some of it, if it's regarded as historical, they keep it, or they decide who keeps it. But the individuals digging it up would be entitled to a fraction, and I don't know how great that is.
Do you believe this will ever be solved?
I hope that it would, but it just seems like, we haven't got any closer spending the new millions, so it's still kind of tough to say that, it will. I think the treasure was moved somewhere else, and when my book came out, actually I still get them, but I always get letters and phone calls. Oh, the treasure is now in Michigan, or the treasure is in this place, and some of it makes sense. There's other islands there too, and it was rumored that from Oak Island there was a tunnel to another island, and I went looking for that myself and never found anything. It was funny when I got started with it. I was very welcome up there and taken around and everything. And later on, after my book came out, I just there's a few people, I have a few friends up there, but Blankenship like kind of shut me out. He wouldn't let me come on the island. I had to sneak on with my kayak.
Why are they angry with you? Wouldn't they be happy that you're promoting the region?
I would think so. And in general, I was received well. There's a place called the Oak Island Marina, and that's where they have a hotel there, which is really nice. And the guy, I think his name is John Harvey. He was like my best friend when I was up there. They have a person that makes reservations for like events there. He had a virtual museum of Oak Island stuff, and so we've remained friends. Some of the other people that worked with Blankenship, I still have a good relationship with, although Blankenship, no. So, I don't know. But I know that, what's his name? Finan O'Connor. I can't think of his right name. A guy named Finan, who wrote a book on Oak Island. He said they won't let him on the island, and Blankenship doesn't like him and all. Blankenship's like in his 80s, so he's got a little cranky. And when I said he had a rough time with Tobias, they would sit in two different rooms, and another guy, guy named Bill Milstead, would communicate for them. So if Tobias said one thing, Milstead would go in the other room and repeat it to Blankenship, who would say something else, and then they'd come back. And it reminds me more of the movie Goodfellas, where Paulie never talked to anybody.
Blankenship? That curmudgeon.
Yeah, his son looks like he has more of an open mind. And next time I go up there, I'll try to meet more people, the current people. I was up one year filming a thing called Holy Grail in America, and that was a lot of fun. And you don't get paid for that, supposedly, but it's fun being in it because the History Channel runs it over and over again. And then 4 weeks later, I was up there for speaking at a thing called Explore Oak Island Day, and met a lot of the players then.
Stephen Sora, great show, interesting stuff. We talked before the show, and you explained to me that the website's not up and running, but what's the best way then for the audience to get in touch with you to learn more about you?
If they want to get in touch with me, I'm on Facebook. That might be the best way. I have a little site on Facebook, but I don't keep it as active as my real friend site.
Doing any more writing these days?
I've been working on a book for the last 5 years about the Rosicrucians' influence in the United States, and a couple items that are connected with it, like who wrote Shakespeare and where did Sir Francis Bacon really go, because it doesn't seem like he was buried in the church that he supposedly was, and who killed Shakespeare. A lot of good stuff. I'm just tying it together now.
Well, love to have you back on the show. Perhaps we can chat again.
Sounds good to me. Russell, thanks for inviting me.
Okay, Stephen Sora, thank you so much for being a guest on the program.
Thank you.